I mean, you can't blame them for thinking it was the end. In the year 410, when the Visigoths actually broke through the walls of Rome, it must have felt like the sky itself was falling. This scholar, Saint Jerome, he heard the news all the way out in Bethlehem, and he wrote this down. Just think about that for a second. The city that took the whole world was itself taken. For pretty much everyone alive, this was it. This was the end.
It's a powerful story, for sure. One that shaped how we see history for centuries. But what if that powerful image is just wrong? What if the whole idea of a sudden, catastrophic fall is actually hiding a much more complicated and, honestly, a way more interesting story?
To really get to the bottom of this, we have to start with the words themselves. You know, the words we use to describe history aren't just labels, they're frames. And if you change the frame, you change the whole picture. And this right here shows you exactly what I mean. On one side, you've got the word collapse. It just sounds final, doesn't it? It's destruction, it's an end. But on the other side, you have transformation. That feels completely different. It's about adapting, transitioning, it suggests a beginning. One is basically a tombstone, the other is a doorway.
There's this great historian, Gregory Eldrate, who puts it perfectly. He says if you could go back in a time machine to the year 500 AD, you wouldn't find a giant smoking crater where the Roman Empire used to be. No, you'd find a world that was still very recognizably Roman. It was just kind of operating under new management.
And that's really the core of the issue here. That term fall is totally loaded. It's a story told from the viewpoint of the Roman elites, the people inside the palace walls. It's a story that's all about what they were losing.
So if we really want to get the full story, we have to step outside those walls. We need to see this whole era through the eyes of the so-called outsiders, because for them, Rome's crisis wasn't a catastrophe. Oh no, it was the opportunity of a lifetime.
So let's meet the new players on the scene. We're going to focus on three of the most famous groups: the Goths, the Vandals, and the Huns. And we're going to look at them not as some mindless, destructive horde, but as the main characters in a brand new story, as strategic thinkers, innovators, and survivors.
Just take the Goths. Their story is wow. It's an epic. They start out as desperate refugees on the banks of the Danube River, literally fleeing for their lives. Then they become allies of Rome, fighting as federates for an empire that both desperately needs them and totally exploits them. And finally, they rise up, not just to sack a city, but to use that power to negotiate the very first independent kingdom on Roman soil. Think about that arc, from refugee to ruler in a little over one generation. And what about the Vandals? Forget the modern meaning of the word. These guys were brilliant strategists. They looked at the massive Roman Empire and they figured out its biggest weakness. It was totally dependent on the grain coming from North Africa. So what they do? They built a navy, sailed across the Mediterranean, and captured the entire breadbasket of the empire. It was a checkmate move that crippled Rome's economy and literally changed the map. Then you have the Huns under Attila. They had a completely different business model. They weren't all that interested in the hassle of conquering Roman land. They wanted its money, so they perfected a system based on pure fear. They realized that the threat of their army was way more profitable for shaking down Rome for massive payments of gold than actually fighting was. It was basically a continent-sized protection racket.
So as all these new powers start playing the game by their own rules, that old, simple line between who was Roman and who was barbarian just starts to completely dissolve.
In fact, for a lot of these so-called barbarian leaders, the path to power looked pretty Roman actually. First, you serve in the Roman army. Then, you take advantage of one of Rome's endless civil wars. You use that chaos to gain political power, and then you just adopt and adapt the Roman structures for yourself. It was a well-worn path. This quote from Eldrate just nails it. They weren't some single unified enemy. They were fluid. They were adaptable. They'd fight for Rome one year and against it the next. It all depended on what was in their best interest. They were playing politics just as much as they were fighting wars.
So, after all this chaos and conflict and strategic maneuvering, what was the result? Was it the end of the world? Or was it just the violent, messy birth of a new one? When these new leaders took over, they didn't want to just smash everything to bits. They were way too smart for that. They took over the things that actually mattered. The gold in the treasury, the farmland you could tax, the roads and aqueducts that kept society running. And maybe most important of all, they took over the sophisticated Roman legal and government systems that had been built up over centuries. So really, if we want to get it right, we should stop thinking of it as a fall.
Let's call it what it was, a hostile takeover. A hostile takeover where the new management came in, kept all the valuable assets, and just rebranded the company.
And that is the real legacy of this entire period. The Western Roman Empire didn't just die, it was transformed. It got absorbed, remixed, and reborn into something totally new. The collection of kingdoms that would eventually become the Europe we know today.
Which, leaves us with one last pretty big thought. If a civilization as powerful as Rome didn't really fall but just transformed into its next phase, what does that say about how we should think about the end of any era, including maybe our own?